Ladies and gentlemen, Game of Thrones. I'm excited. As of per our other series, I'm not going to be reading the entire book, but a third or two-thirds of it, if I, if I can get away with it. If they get struck, I have to take them down, so apologies. But if you are currently following the series, best get listening to it quickly. Um, some of the other series I've read haven't been just as famous, so obviously there's not, I don't know, bots looking quite as hard for any possible strikes. And since we're just watching Nimbus and there's no music or anything like that, we're currently flying under the radar, but I don't know how long that's going to last. So do listen to them while they're up. But we'll begin with the prologue. Oh, and apologies in advance. I've some of these names are going to probably make people who know how to actually pronounce them cringe, but we'll get there. We should turn back, Garrett urged as his words began to grow dark around him. The woods began to grow dark around them. The wildlings are dead. Do they frighten you? Sir Waymer Royce. Waymer? Royce asked, with just a hint of a smile. Garrett did not rise to the bait. He was an old man, past 50, and he had seen the lordlings come and go. Dead is dead, he said. We have no business with the dead. Are they dead? Royce asked softly. What proof we have, or do we have? Will saw them, Garrett said. If he says they're dead, that's proof enough for me. Will had known they would drag him into a quarrel sooner or later. He wished it had been the latter rather than the sooner. My mother told me that dead men sing no songs, he put it. My wet nurse said the same thing, Will, Royce replied. Never believe anything that you hear at a woman's tit. There are things to be learned, even from the dead. His voice echoed, too loud in the twilit forest. We've a long ride before us, Garrett pointed out. 8 days, maybe 9, and night is falling. Sir Wimmer Royce glanced at the sky with disinterest. It does that every day about this time. Are you unmanned by the dark, Garrett? Will could see the tightness around Garrett's mouth. He barely suppressed the anger in his eyes under the thick black hood of his cloak. Garrett had spent 40 years in the night's watch, man and boy, and he was not accustomed to being made light of. Yet there was more than that. Under the wounded pride, Wilkin sensed something in the older man. You could taste it, a nervous tension that came perilously close to fear. Will shared his unease. He had been 4 years on the wall. The first time he had been sent beyond, all the stories had come rushing back, and his bowels turned to water. He had laughed about it afterwards. He was a veteran of 100 rangings by now, but the endless dark wilderness of that Southron, called the Haunted Forest, had no more terrors for him. Until tonight. Something was different tonight. There was an edge to this darkness that made his hackles rise. 9 days they had been riding, north and northwest, and then north again, farther and farther from the wall, hard on the track of a band of wildling raiders. Each day had been worse than the day that had come before it. Today was the worst of all. A cold wind was blowing out of the north, and it made the trees rustle like living things. All day Will had felt as though something was watching him, something cold and implacable that loved him not. Garrett had felt it too. Will wanted nothing so much as to ride hell-bent for the safety of the wall, but that was not a feeling to share with your commander, especially not a commander like this one. Sir Waymer Royce was the youngest son of an ancient house with too many heirs. He was a handsome youth of 18, grey-eyed and graceful and slender as a knife, mounted on his huge black destrier. The night towered above Will and Garrett, their smaller garrons. He wore black leather boots, black woolen pants, black moleskin gloves, and a fine, supple coat of gleaming black ringmail over layers of black wool, boiled leather. Sir Whammer had been the sworn brother of the Night's Watch for less than half a year, but no one could say that he had not prepared for his vocation, at least in so far as his wardrobe was concerned. His cloak was his crowning glory, sable, thick and black and soft as sin. Bet he killed them all himself if he did, Garrett told the barracks over wine. Twisted their little heads off, our mighty warrior. They all shared the laugh. It was hard to take orders from a man that you laughed at in your cups. Will reflected as he sat shivering atop his garron. Garrett must have felt the same. Mormont said we should track them, and we did, Garrett said. They're dead. They shan't trouble us no more. There's hard riding before us. I don't like this weather. If it snows, we could be a fortnight getting back. The snow's best we can hope for. Ever seen an ice storm, my lord? The lordling seemed not to hear him. He studied the deepening twilight in that half-bored, half-distracted way he had. Will had ridden with the night long enough to understand that it was best not to interrupt him when he looked like that. Tell me what you saw, Will. All the details. Leave nothing out. Will had been a hunter before he joined the Night's Watch. Well, a poacher, in truth. Mallister free riders had caught him red-handed in Mallister's own woods, skinning one of Mallister's own bucks. It had been a choice of putting on the black or losing a hand. No one could move through the woods as silent as Will, and it had not taken the Black brothers long to discover his talent. The camp is 2 miles further on, over the ridge, hard beside the stream, Will said. I got close as I dared. There's 8 of them, men and women both. No children I could see. They put up a lean-to against the rock. The snow's pretty well covered it now, but I could still make it out. No fire burning, but the fire pit was still plain as day. No one moving. I watched for a long time. No living man has ever laid so still. Did you see any blood? Well, no, Will admitted. Did you see any weapons? Some swords, a few bows. One man had an axe, heavy-looking, double-bladed, a cruel piece of iron. It was on the ground beside him, right by his hand. Did you make a note of the position of the bodies? Will shrugged. A couple are sitting up against the rock. Most of them are on the ground, fallen like. Or sleeping, Royce suggested. Fallen, Will insisted. There's one woman up in Ironwood, half hid in the branches. A far eyes, he smiled thinly. I took care she never saw me. When I got closer, I saw she wasn't moving either. Despite himself, he shivered. You have a chill? Royce asked. Some, Will muttered. The wind, my lord. The young knight turned back to his grizzled man-at-arms. Frost-fallen leaves whispered past them, and Royce's destrier moved restlessly. Destrier. What do you think might have killed these men, Garrett? Sir Waymer asked casually. He adjusted the drape of his long sable cloak. It was cold, Garrett said with iron certainty. I saw men freeze last winter, and one before, when I was half a boy. Everyone talks about snows 40 foot deep, and how icy winds come howling out of the north, but the real enemy is the cold. It steals up on you quieter than will, and at first you shiver, and your teeth chatter, and you stomp your feet, and dream of mulled wine and nice hot fires. It burns, it does. Nothing burns like cold. But only for a while, and then it gets inside you, starts to fill you up, and after a while you don't have the strength to fight it. It's easier to just sit down, go to sleep. They say you don't feel any pain toward the end. First you go weak and drowsy, and then everything starts to fade, and then there's a sinking into the sea of warm milk, peaceful like. Such eloquence, Garrett, Sir Wimmer observed. I never suspected you had it in you. I've had the cold in me too, lordling. Garrett pulled back his hood, giving Sir Wimmer a good long look at the stumps of his ears, where they had been. 2 ears, 3 toes, and a little finger off my left hand. I got off light. We found my brother frozen at his watch, with a smile on his face. Sir Wimmer shrugged. You ought to dress more warmly, Garrett. Garrett glared at the lordling. Scars around his ear holes flushed red with anger where Mr. Eamon had cut his ears away. We'll see how warm you can dress when winter comes. He pulled up his hood and hunched over his garron, silent and sullen. If Garrett said it was the cold, Will began. Have you drawn any watches this past week, Will? Yes, my lord. There, there never was a week when we did not draw a dozen bloody watches. What was the man driving at? And how did you find the wall? Weeping, Will said, frowning. It was clear enough now that the lordling had pointed it out. They couldn't have frozen, not if the wall was weeping. It wasn't cold enough. Royce nodded. Bright lad. We've had a few light frosts this past week, and a quick flurry of snow now and then, but surely no cold fierce enough to kill 8 men. Men clad in fur and leather. Let me remind you, with shelter near at hand, and the means of making fire. The knight's smile was cocksure. Will, lead us there. I would see these dead men for myself. And then there was nothing to be done for it. The order had been given, and they were honour bound to obey. Will went in front, his shaggy little garron picking his way carefully through the undergrowth. A light snow had fallen the night before, and the stones and the roots were hidden in sinks lying just under the crust, waiting for the careless and the unwary. Sir Wimmer Royce came next, his great black destrier snorting impatiently. The warhorse was the wrong mount for ranging, but try and tell that to a lordling. Garrett brought up the rear, the old man-at-arms muttering to himself as he rode. Twilight deepened. The cloudless sky turned a deep purple, the colour of an old bruise, then faded to black. The stars began to come out. A half-moon rose. Will was grateful for the light. We can make better pace than this, surely, Royce said, when the moon was full risen. Not with this horse, Will said. Fear made him insolent. Perhaps my lord would care to take the lead. Sir Wimmer Royce did not deign to reply. Somewhere off in the wood, a wolf howled. Will pulled his garron over beneath the ancient gnarled ironwood and dismounted. Why are you stopping? Sir Wimmer asked. Best to go the rest of the way on foot, my lord. It's just over that ridge. Royce paused for a moment, staring off into the distance, his face reflective. A cold wind whispered through the trees. His great sable cloak stirred beneath him like something half alive. There's something wrong here, Garrett muttered. The young knight gave him a disdainful smile. Is there? Can't you feel it? Garrett asked. Listen to the darkness. Will could feel it. 4 years in the night's watch, and he'd never been so afraid. What was it? Wind, trees rustling. A wolf? Which sound is it that unmans you so, Garrett? When Garrett did not answer, Royce slid gracefully from his saddle and tied the destrier securely in the low hanging limb, well away from the other horses. He drew his longsword from its sheath. Jewels glittered in its hilt, and the moonlight ran down the shining steel. It was a splendid weapon, castle forged and new made from the look of it. Will doubted it had ever been swung in anger. The trees press close here, Will warned. That sword will tangle you up, my lord. Better a knife. If I needed instruction, I will ask for it, the young lord said. Garrett, stay here. Control the horses. Garrett dismounted. We need a fire. I'll see to it. How big a fool are you, old man? If there are enemies in this woods, fire will be the last thing that we want. There's some enemies fire will keep away, Garrett said. Bears and direwolves and other things. Sir Wimmer's mouth was a hard line. No fire. Garrett's hood shadows his face, but Will could see the hard glitter in his eyes as he stared at the night. For a moment he was afraid the older man would go for his sword. It was a short, ugly thing, its grip discoloured by sweat, its edge nicked from hard use, but Bill would not have given an iron blob for the lordling's life if Garrett pulled it from its scabbard. Finally Garrett looked down. No fire, he muttered low under his breath. Royce took it for acquiescence and turned away. Lead on, he said to Will. Will threaded their way through the thicket and then started up the slope to the low ridge where they found the vantage point under the sentinel tree. Under the thin crust of snow, the ground was damp and muddy, slick footing, with rocks hidden and roots to trip you up. Will made no sound as he climbed. Behind him he heard the soft, metallic slither of the lordling's ringmail, the rustle of leaves, and the muttering of curses as he reached the branches. They grabbed his long sword and tugged him on his splendid sable cloak. The great sentinel was right there at the top of the ridge, where Will had known it would be, its lowest branches a bare foot off the ground. Will slid in underneath, flat on his belly in the snow and the mud, and looked down at the empty clearing below. His heart stopped in its chest. For a moment he dared not breathe. Moonlight shone down on the clearing, the ashes of the fire pit, the snow-covered lean-to, the great rock, and the little half-frozen stream. Everything was as it had been a few hours ago, except they were gone. The bodies were gone. Gods, he heard behind him. A sword slashed at a branch, and Sir Wimmer Royce gained the ridge. He stood there beside the sentinel, long sword in hand, his cloak billowing behind him as the wind came up, outlining nobility against the stars for all to see. "Get down," Will whispered urgently. "Something's wrong." Royce did not move. He looked down at the empty clearing and laughed. "Your dead men seem to have moved camp, Will." Will's voice abandoned him. He groped for words. It did not come. It was not possible. His eyes crept back and forth over the abandoned campsite, stopping on the axe. A huge, double-bladed axe was lying where it had been last, untouched, a valuable weapon. "On your feet, Will," Sir Wimmer commanded. "There's no one here. I won't have you hiding under a bush." Reluctantly, Will obeyed. Sir Wimmer looked over him in disapproval. "I'm not going back to Castle Black, a failure on my first ranging. We will find these men." He glanced around. "Up the tree, be quick about it, and look for a fire." Will turned away, wordless. It was no use to argue. The wind was moving. It cut right through him. He went to the tree, vaulting grey-green sentinel, and began to climb. Soon his hands were sticky with sap, and he was lost among the needles. Fear filled his gut like a meal that he would not digest. He whispered a prayer to the nameless gods of the wood and slipped his dirk free of its sheath. He put it between his teeth to keep both hands free for climbing. The taste of cold iron in his mouth gave him comfort. Down below, the lordling called out suddenly, "Who goes there?" Will heard uncertainty in the challenge. He stopped climbing and listened. He watched. The woods gave an answer, the rustle of leaves, the icy rush of the stream, and a distant hoot of a snowy owl. The others made no sound. Will saw movement from the corner of his eye, pale shapes gliding through the woods. He turned his head, glimpsed a white shadow in the darkness, then it was gone. Branches stirred gently in the wind, scratching one another with wooden fingers. Will opened his mouth to call down a warning, and the words seemed to freeze in his throat. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps it had only been a bird, a reflection on the snow, some trick of the moonlight. What had he seen, after all? Will, where are you? Sir Waymer called up. Can you see anything? He was turning in a slow circle, suddenly weary, his sword in hand. He must have felt them, as Will felt them. There was nothing to see. Answer me. Why is it so cold? It was cold. Shivering, Will clung more tightly to his perch, his face pressing hard against the trunk of the sentinel. He could feel the sweat, or the sweet, sticky sap on his cheek. A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Tall it was, gaunt, and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armour seemed to change colour as it moved. Here it was white as new fallen snow, and here black as shadow, everywhere dappled with the deep grey-green of the trees. The patterns ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. Will heard the breath go out of Sir Wimmer Royce in his long hiss. Come no further, the lordling warned. His voice cracked like a boy's. He threw the long sable cloak back over his shoulder to free his arms for battle, and then took the sword in both hands. The wind had stopped. It was very cold. The other slid forward on silent feet. In his hand was a long sword, like none Will had ever seen. No human metal had gone into forging that blade. It was alive with moonlight, translucent, a shard of crystal so thin it seemed almost to vanish when seen edge on. There was a faint blue shimmer of a thing, ghost light that played around the edges, and somehow Will knew it was sharper than any razor. Sir Wimmer met him bravely. Dance with me then. He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps the cold. Yet, in that moment, Will thought he was a boy no longer, but a man of the night's watch. The other halted. Will saw his eyes, blue, deeper blue than any human eyes, blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the long sword, trembling on high, watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. They suddenly emerged silently from the shadows, twins to the first. 3 of them, 4, 5. Sir Wimmer may have felt the cold that came with them, but he never saw them, never heard them. Will had to call out. It was his duty, and his death if he did. He shivered and hugged the tree and kept the silence. The pale sword came shivering through the air. Sir Wimmer met it with steel. When the blades met, there was no ring of metal on metal, only a high, thin sound of the edge, of hearing, like an animal screaming in pain. Royce checked the second blow and the third, and then fell back a step. Another flurry of blows. He fell back again. Behind him, to his right, to his left, all around him, the watchers stood, patient, faceless, silent, the shifting patterns of their delicate armour making them all but invisible in the wood. Yet they made no move to interfere. Again and again the swords met, until Will wanted to cover his ears against the strange, anguished keening of their clash. Sir Wimmer was panting from the effort now, his breath streaming in the moonlight. The blade was black and white with frost. The others danced with a pale blue light. When Royce's parry came a beat too late, the sword bit through the ringmail beneath his arm. The young lord cried out in pain. Blood welled between the rings. It steamed in the cold, and the droplets seemed red as fire everywhere they touched the snow. Sir Wimmer's fingers brushed his side. His moleskin glove came away soaked with red. The other said something in a language that Will did not know. His voice was like the cracking of ice in winter lake, and the words were mocking. Sir Wimmer Royce found his fury. "For Robert!" he shouted, and came up snarling, lifting the frost-covered longsword with both hands and swinging it around in a flat side-arm slash with all his weight behind it. The other's parry was almost lazy. Where the blades touched, the steel shattered. A scream echoed throughout the night, and the longsword shivered into 100 brittle pieces, the shards scattered like rain. Royce went to his knees, shrieking, and covered his eyes, blood welling between his fingers. The watchers moved forward together, as if when some signal had been given. Swords rose and fell in deathly silence. It was a cold butchery. The pale blades danced through the ring mail as if it were silk. Will closed his eyes. Far beneath him he heard their voices and laughter, sharp as icicles. When he found the courage to look again, a long time had passed, and the ridge below was empty. He stayed in the tree, scarce daring to breathe, while the moon crept slowly across the black sky. Finally, his muscles cramping and his fingers numb with cold, he climbed down. Royce's body lay face down in the snow, one arm outflung. The thick sable cloak had been slashed in a dozen places. Lying dead, like that. You saw how young he was, a boy. He found what was left of the sword a few feet away, the end splintered and twisted like a tree struck by lightning. Will knelt, looked around wearily, snatched it up. The broken sword would be his proof. Garrett would not know what to make of it, and if not him, then surely that old bear Mormont or Maester Aemon. Would Garrett still be waiting with the horses? He had to hurry. Will rose. Sir Wimmer Royce stood over him. His fine clothes were a tatter, his face a ruin. A shard from his sword transfixed the blind white pupil of his left eye. The right eye was open. The pupil turned blue. It saw. The broken sword fell from nerveless fingers. Will closed his eyes to pray. Long, elegant hands brushed his cheek, then tightened around his throat. They were gloved in the finest moleskin and sticky with blood, yet the touch was icy cold. And that's the end of the prologue. Thank you for listening. We'll do more of this, and I'll upload that soon for you. Thanks very much.